What, my bike?
A dying 7-year-old watched his father wire a bomb under a Hells Angels motorcycle. Then his father looked up, smiled at him, and signaled him to stay quiet. What the boy did next would shatter the internet and expose who really protects children when their own blood wants them dead. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story reaches, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Now, let's get into the story. The winter wind off Lake Michigan cut through Milwaukee's near north side like a blade, turning February into a test of survival for anyone without heat. In apartment 3B of the condemned Riverview Towers on West Walnut Street, 7-year-old Sabian Miller had stopped shivering 3 hours ago. That's when you knew the cold had won. When your body gave up fighting and just went numb. He sat wrapped in every blanket his mother owned, which amounted to 2 threadbare comforters and a beach towel from a vacation they'd never taken, pressed against the window that overlooked the street below. The glass was so cold it burned his forehead, but Sabian didn't move. He couldn't. Moving took energy, and energy required food, and the last meal he'd eaten was a sleeve of saltine crackers his mom had brought home from the gas station where she worked the graveyard shift. That was yesterday, or maybe the day before. Time got fuzzy when you were dying. The doctors at County Hospital had used that word 6 months ago, dying, like it was just another medical term on a chart. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Stage 4. Without treatment, maybe 6 months. With treatment, maybe years. But treatment cost money, and money was something the Miller family had never possessed in sufficient quantities to matter to people who made decisions about who lived and who died in America. Sabian's feeding tube itched where it entered his stomach, the adhesive pulling at skin that had grown too thin over bones that showed through like architecture. His mother, Darlene, had tried to keep up with the maintenance, but the home health nurse had stopped coming when their Medicaid got suspended over some paperwork error that no one at the state office seemed interested in fixing. So now the tube site was red and angry, probably infected, and Sabian had learned not to mention it because his mom would just cry. And her crying made Mrs. Gable from 3C bang on the walls. Mrs. Gable. Even thinking her name made Sabian's chest tight with a fear that had nothing to do with the cancer eating his white blood cells. She was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like a badge of honor, who'd moved into the building 6 weeks ago and immediately appointed herself the moral authority of the 3rd floor. She had opinions about everything. About Darlene's work schedule, about the medical equipment cluttering the hallway, about the way Sabian's wheelchair squeaked when his mother pushed him to the community bathroom because their apartment's plumbing had been condemned. But mostly Mrs. Gable had opinions about the noise. Any noise. Darlene's quiet sobbing at 2 a.m. when she thought Sabian was asleep, the beeping of the portable oxygen concentrator the clinic had loaned them, the sound of a mother trying and failing to keep her child alive in a country that had decided their poverty was a moral failing rather than a systemic problem. Sabian heard Mrs. Gable now, her voice rising through the paper-thin walls like a siren. "I have work in the morning, Darlene. Some of us have real jobs. Some of us contribute to society instead of living off handouts and feeling sorry for ourselves." There was a pause, and Sabian knew his mother was standing in the hallway, probably still in her gas station uniform, probably still smelling like cigarette smoke and desperation, trying to apologize for existing. "I'm sorry," Darlene's voice came through muffled and broken. "He had a bad night. The pain, I was just trying to comfort him." "Well, try comforting him quieter. Or better yet, let the state take him. They've got facilities for kids like that, hospice centers, places where the rest of us don't have to listen to it." Sabian felt something crack inside his chest, and it wasn't the tumor pressing against his lungs. It was the realization that to people like Mrs. Gable, he wasn't a child. He was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved through removal rather than compassion. He pressed his face harder against the frozen window, watching the street below where the only light came from the neon sign of Rosie's Tap, the bar that anchored the corner of Walnut and Garfield. And that's where they were. The Hells Angels. Sabian had been watching them for months, ever since the Milwaukee chapter had started using Rosie's back room for their weekly meetings. They'd roll up on machines that sounded like thunder, all chrome and leather and patches that told stories Sabian didn't fully understand but desperately wanted to. There were usually 6 or 7 of them, sometimes more, and Sabian had learned their patterns the way other kids learned baseball statistics. The big one with the gray beard and the scar running down his left cheek, that was Silas Compton. Sabian had heard Rosie, the bar owner, call him Prez once when Silas had helped her carry kegs in from the delivery truck. President. That meant he was the leader, the one the others looked to when decisions needed making. Silas was the one Sabian watched most carefully, because there was something in the way the man moved. Careful, but confident, aware, but not afraid, that reminded Sabian of the soldiers he'd seen in movies, men who'd seen bad things and survived them and carried the weight of that survival in their shoulders. Tonight, there were 8 bikes parked outside Rosie's, their chrome catching the streetlight and throwing fractured rainbows across the snow-packed sidewalk. Sabian could see the angels through the bar's front window, gathered around a table, laughing about something. They looked happy. They looked like family. They looked like everything Sabian's life wasn't. And then he saw something that made his blood turn colder than the winter air. A figure moving in the alley beside Rosie's, moving with purpose, moving with intent. The figure wore a dark hoodie and moved like someone who didn't want to be seen. And when he crouched beside Silas's bike, the massive black and chrome Harley-Davidson that always parked closest to the door, Sabian felt his heart start to hammer. The figure pulled something from a backpack, something rectangular and black with wires coming out of it. Sabian's 7-year-old brain didn't know the technical term for C4 explosive, but he knew bad when he saw it. And he knew something else, something that made the cancer in his blood feel insignificant compared to the horror flooding his system. When the figure in the hoodie stood up and turned toward the streetlight for just a moment, Sabian saw his face. And it was his father. Sabian's father hadn't been called Snake Miller for nothing. He'd earned that nickname in Waupun State Prison doing a nickel for armed robbery, earned it by being the kind of man who'd sell out his cellmate for an extra pack of cigarettes and smile while doing it. He'd walked out of Sabian's life when the boy was 3 months old, disappeared into the Milwaukee underworld of meth distribution and low-level enforcement work for whoever paid. But he'd never fully disappeared, just enough to avoid child support, just enough to dodge responsibility, close enough to remind Darlene that he could show up anytime he wanted and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. And now here he was, crouched in an alley off West Walnut Street, wiring military-grade explosives to a Hells Angels president's motorcycle. The Baja Cartel had paid him $5,000 to take out Silas Compton, said the Angels had been interfering with their distribution network through Milwaukee's North Side, said they wanted to send a message that would echo through every chapter in the Midwest. Snake didn't care about territory or respect or any of that Brotherhood nonsense. He cared about $5,000 and the fact that killing a biker was easier than killing a cop. Less heat, more street cred, win-win. He finished connecting the pressure trigger to the kickstand. Beautiful work, really. Learned from an Army EOD tech he'd met in county lockup, and stood up, brushing snow off his knees. The device was elegant, simple. The moment Silas's weight came off that kickstand and hit the ignition, the explosion would vaporize him and probably take out the front of Rosie's tap as collateral damage. Snake was pulling his hood tighter when he felt it. That sixth sense that came from years of living on the wrong side of the law, the feeling of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the street, the shadows, the parked cars. Nothing. Just the cold February night and the muffled sound of the angels laughing inside the bar. But then his eyes drifted up. 3rd floor, window to the right. And there he was, Sabian, his son, the kid he hadn't seen in 7 years, the mistake he'd tried to forget. Standing at the window in that condemned building Darlene had been complaining about in her desperate text messages, Snake never answered. The boy was staring straight at him, and even from 3 stories up, even through the dirty glass and the falling snow, Snake could see the recognition in those eyes. The kid had seen everything. For one brief moment, something that might have been conscience flickered in Snake's chest. His own son, dying of cancer according to Darlene's texts, living in poverty, watching his father plant a bomb that could kill dozens. But conscience was expensive, and Snake had sold his years ago. So instead of panic, instead of shame, Snake did something that would haunt Milwaukee for months to come. He looked up at his dying son, pressed one finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, and smiled. Not a warm smile, not a father's smile, a threat, a promise. Stay quiet, kid, or things get worse for you and your mother. Then Snake turned and walked away into the alley, disappearing into the maze of dumpsters and fire escapes, leaving his son alone with a choice no 7-year-old should ever have to make. Sabian stood frozen at the window, his heart hammering so hard it made the feeding tube site throb with pain. His father. The man who was supposed to protect him, who was supposed to love him, who shared his blood and his last name. That man had just rigged a bomb to kill the bikers Sabian watched every week. The men who'd never hurt anyone in this neighborhood. The men who'd helped Rosie fix her broken window last month. The men who'd given money to the homeless vet who slept in the doorway of the abandoned grocery store. And his father wanted them dead. Wanted to blow them into pieces, and wanted Sabian to stay silent while it happened. The boy's hands were shaking as he pulled away from the window. Mrs. Gable was still yelling in the hallway, something about calling the landlord, about getting them evicted, about how people like the Millers were dragging down property values. His mother was crying because she was exhausted and scared and trying to keep her son alive in a country that had decided his life wasn't worth the cost of treatment. But Sabian wasn't thinking about any of that anymore. He was thinking about the note he'd write, about the bike downstairs, about doing the one good thing his short, painful life might ever accomplish. Sabian's legs hadn't worked properly in 3 weeks. The leukemia had spread to his bones, turning simple movement into agony that even the expired Tylenol his mother rationed couldn't touch. Walking from the mattress to the bathroom required 20 minutes and left him gasping. The stairs down to street level? That was suicide. But suicide was relative when you were already dying. The angels would leave Rosie's tap around 11, Sabian knew from watching. They'd laugh. They'd clasp hands in that way men did when words weren't enough, and then they'd mount their bikes and thunder off into the Milwaukee night. Silas always left last. Always did one final check of the bar, made sure Rosie locked up safe, made sure the street was clear. That gave Sabian maybe 30 minutes. He found paper in the shoebox under his mother's bed, the box where she kept the medical bills she couldn't pay, the eviction notices she couldn't fight, the collection letters that proved poverty in America was a crime punished with systematic cruelty. He found a crayon, purple, the only one left from a coloring book some church volunteer had brought 6 months ago in a care package that felt more like pity than charity. His hand shook so badly the letters came out crooked and childlike, but the message was clear. Mr. Biker, please don't start your engine. My daddy put a bad box under it. I don't want you to go to heaven yet. 3rd floor window on right if you don't believe me. Sabian. He folded the note carefully, tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. The winter coat that was 2 sizes too small, because kids with cancer don't grow right, and new clothes cost money better spent on medication. Then came the hard part. The hallway was clear. Mrs. Gable's door mercifully shut. Sabian could hear his mother in the bathroom, running water to wash the gas station smell off her skin before her 4 hours of sleep. She'd try to stop him if she knew, would cry and hold him and tell him it wasn't his responsibility to save anyone. But that's where mothers were wrong. It was exactly his responsibility. Because if not him, who? If a dying kid couldn't do one good thing before the cancer won, what was the point of any of it? The stairs were concrete. 3 flights, 42 steps. Sabian knew because he'd counted them once when his legs still worked. He started down, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching the note. His vision swam. Pain shot through his femurs with every step, white-hot and electric. Halfway down the 1st flight, his knees buckled. He caught himself on the rail, tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. Keep moving. The bikers would die if he didn't keep moving. 2nd floor. The landing spun. Sabian's breath came in gasps that rattled in his chest, wet and wrong. The feeding tube pulled at his stomach and he felt something warm spreading under his shirt, probably bleeding, probably infection. Didn't matter. 3rd flight. Sabian's legs gave out completely. He went down hard, tumbling, the concrete steps slamming into his shoulders, his hips, his skull. He landed in a heap at the bottom, stars exploding behind his eyes, the note still clutched in his fist. The cold air hit him when he pushed through the building's front door. Milwaukee in February was 20 degrees and dropping, and Sabian was wearing a t-shirt under his thin jacket because winter coats for dying kids weren't a budget priority. The snow had stopped, but the wind off Lake Michigan cut through him like he was made of paper. Silas's bike was 15 feet away. Might as well have been 15 miles. Sabian crawled, hands and knees across the icy sidewalk, past the salt stains and cigarette butts, past the frozen dog waste nobody cleaned up, toward the chrome and leather and hope. He could hear voices inside Rosie's. Laughter, the clink of bottles, normal people living normal lives while a 7-year-old dragged himself through the snow to save them. His fingers found the kickstand, numb and clumsy. He pulled the note from his pocket, realized he had no tape, nothing to secure it with, so he jammed it into the kickstand mechanism itself, wedging it tight, praying it would hold. And then Sabian's body decided it was done. Just done. The world tilted sideways. The concrete rushed up to meet him. And the last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the door to Rosie's tap swinging open, and Silas Compton's massive silhouette stepping into the light. Silas Compton had held dying men before. In Fallujah, in Kandahar, in places the Pentagon called operations, and soldiers called slaughterhouses. He knew the weight of a body giving up, knew the specific way breath changed when the spirit started letting go. So when he saw the kid collapsed beside his Harley, he didn't hesitate. He was across the sidewalk in 3 strides, his brothers pouring out of Rosie's behind him, and he was on his knees in the snow pulling the boy into his arms before his brain even processed what he was seeing. A child, maybe 7, maybe 8, skeletal, feeding tube, skin like paper, eyes rolling back. "Call 911!" Silas roared, and Reaper was already on his phone. But the kid was fighting consciousness, one hand reaching up to grab Silas's leather vest, pulling him close with desperate strength that didn't match his dying frame. "The note," the boy whispered. "Read the note. Under your bike. My daddy, he put—" And then Sabian was gone, body going limp in Silas's arms. But his words echoed like a bomb themselves. "Under your bike, my daddy." Silas looked up at Hangman, and something unspoken passed between them, the kind of combat communication that saved lives. Hangman moved to the Harley, crouched low, his phone's flashlight illuminating the chassis. "Jesus Christ," Hangman breathed. "Silas, don't move. Nobody move." The street went silent except for the wind. Hangman's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking when he pulled the piece of purple crayon paper from the kickstand. "We got C4 under here, military grade, pressure trigger on the kickstand. You'd been paced, Prez." Silas looked down at the boy in his arms, at the note Hangman was now reading aloud, and felt something he hadn't felt since his own son died in a car accident 12 years ago. Pure, undiluted rage mixed with grief. This kid, this dying kid, had used his last ounce of strength to save a stranger, had crawled down 3 flights of stairs and across a frozen sidewalk to warn a biker he'd never met. And his own father, his own goddamn father, had planted the bomb. The Milwaukee PD bomb squad arrived in 7 minutes, shut down the block, evacuated Rosie's and the surrounding buildings. It took them 45 minutes to dismantle the device, and their lead tech, a grizzled veteran named Morrison, who'd done 2 tours as Army EOD, confirmed what they already knew. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This was meant to kill everyone in a 30-foot radius. You got lucky. Silas looked at Sabian, now wrapped in blankets in the back of an ambulance, paramedics working to stabilize him for transport. "I didn't get lucky. That kid did the work." While the bomb squad finished, Silas did what he did best: recon. He climbed 3 flights of stairs in the Riverview Towers, following the apartment number a neighbor had given him, and knocked on 3B. Darlene Miller answered, looking like she'd aged 100 years in the last hour. Her face crumpled when she saw Silas's patch. "He did something, didn't he? He went outside. I told him to stay inside. I told him—" "Ma'am." Silas's voice was gentle, despite the fury building in his chest. "Your son saved my life. Can I come in?" What he saw inside apartment 3B would fuel his nightmares for years. Empty fridge, eviction notice on the table, medical equipment jury-rigged with duct tape, a mattress on the floor where mother and son slept because the bedroom had black mold. This was America. This was the richest country in the world. And a 7-year-old cancer patient was living in conditions that would shame a third-world refugee camp. St. Mary's Hospital sat on Wisconsin Avenue like a fortress of glass and steel, its gleaming exterior promising healing and hope. But Silas knew better. He'd seen enough brothers get chewed up by the American healthcare system to know that hospitals cared about insurance cards before they cared about heartbeats. The ambulance carrying Sabian screamed into the emergency bay at 11:47 p.m., sirens cutting through the winter night. Silas and 6 of his brothers roared in behind it, their Harleys forming a protective cordon around the vehicle. The paramedics wheeled Sabian in fast, vitals crashing, the boy seizing, and Darlene ran alongside, sobbing, her hand clutching her son's. That's when they hit the wall. Not a physical wall. The bureaucratic kind. The kind that killed people with paperwork. Ms. Patricia Hatcher stood in the emergency room intake corridor like a sentinel, clipboard in hand, her hospital administrator badge catching the fluorescent light. She was 50-something, with the kind of professional coldness that came from decades of reducing human suffering to line items and billing codes. "Stop," she said, and the paramedics actually stopped. "We need insurance verification before we can proceed with treatment beyond emergency stabilization. Does the child have active coverage?" Darlene's voice broke. "It got suspended. There was paperwork. I missed a deadline. But he needs treatment now. He's dying. County General handles charity cases. We can stabilize and transfer." Hatcher's voice was clinical, bored, like she'd delivered this death sentence 1,000 times before. Silas stepped forward, and his 6'4" frame made the administrator take an involuntary step back. "How much?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. "Excuse me? How much does it cost to save that kid's life tonight?" Hatcher's eyes narrowed. "Sir, we don't take cash payments from what? Say it." Silas's brothers flanked him, a wall of leather and muscle and barely controlled violence. "From motorcycle clubs." Hatcher lifted her chin. "Hospital policy. We have to verify the source of funds. Money laundering regulations. I'm sure you understand." What happened next would be viewed 18 million times in the next 72 hours. Reaper pulled out his phone and started recording. Hangman pulled out a roll of $100 bills, legitimate money earned from their collectively owned custom motorcycle shop, money they'd taken up in about 4 minutes when Silas had texted the Brotherhood. "We got $12,000 here," Silas said slowly, his voice carrying to every corner of that emergency room. "American dollars, earned by American veterans who served this country. And you're telling me you won't use it to save a 7-year-old American kid because we wear patches?" Behind them, Sabian seized again on the gurney, his small body convulsing, monitors screaming. Darlene screamed with them. Hatcher didn't flinch. "Transfer him to county. We'll provide emergency stabilization and—" "He'll die in transport," one of the paramedics said quietly. "His vitals are—" "That's not this hospital's liability." Hatcher's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing not cruelty but something worse. Indifference. The banality of evil wrapped in policy and procedure. Silas pulled out his own phone, dialed a number he'd hoped never to use. When the voice answered, he spoke 3 words. "We need you." Then he looked at Hatcher with eyes that had seen men die and had sent men to their deaths, and had learned the exact difference between justice and revenge. "You just made a mistake, ma'am. A very public mistake." The video hit Facebook at 11:52 p.m. By midnight, it had 10,000 views. By 1 a.m., it had cracked 1 million. By dawn, it was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, every news outlet in Wisconsin and beyond. The footage was damning in its simplicity. Sabian Miller, 7 years old, seizing on a hospital gurney while his mother sobbed. $12,000 in cash laid out on the intake desk. A hospital administrator with dead eyes explaining why policy mattered more than a child's life. And in the background, 8 Hell's Angels standing silent as gravestones, letting the system expose itself. The internet did what it does best. It burned with righteous fury. Save Sabian trended nationally within 2 hours. The hospital's phone lines melted down. Their Google reviews cratered from 4.2 stars to 1.3 in 40 minutes. Local news trucks surrounded the building by 3 a.m. And at 4:17 a.m., St. Mary's Hospital's Board of Directors held an emergency meeting and made a decision based not on compassion, but on brand protection. Patricia Hatcher was placed on administrative leave. The cash was accepted with a hastily drafted exception to policy, and Sabian Miller was rushed into emergency treatment while his mother collapsed in Silas Compton's arms, sobbing thank yous into leather that had seen war and blood and brotherhood. The pediatric oncology team worked for 6 hours. Transfusions, chemotherapy, antibiotics for the infected feeding tube site, steroids for the brain swelling, interventions that should have happened months ago if poverty wasn't treated like a moral failure in America. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead oncologist, emerged from the treatment room at 10 a.m., looking exhausted and angry. "He'll live," she told Darlene and the assembled angels. "For now. But he needs ongoing treatment, months of it, possibly years. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know how we're going to make that happen in this system." Silas stood. "You let us worry about the system, Doc. You just keep that kid alive." But while Sabian fought for his life in ICU, another storm was brewing, because the video hadn't just caught the attention of people who wanted to help. It had caught the attention of people who wanted to hurt. Mrs. Gable, from apartment 3C, had watched the news coverage from her living room, her face twisting with something between outrage and opportunity. She'd seen Darlene Miller crying on television, surrounded by bikers. She'd seen the cash. She'd seen what looked to her narrow, bitter mind like exactly what she'd always suspected, that the Millers were involved in something criminal, drug money, gang money, money that explained why they'd been living in that building in the first place. So at 11:30 a.m., while Sabian slept in ICU hooked to machines that breathed for him, Mrs. Gable picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd looked up weeks ago but had been waiting for the right moment to use. Child Protective Services? "Yes, I'd like to report a case of child endangerment. The mother is associating with a criminal motorcycle gang. There's evidence of drug money. The child is being used for—" She paused, letting the lie calcify into something she could almost believe. "For trafficking purposes. Someone needs to remove that boy before something terrible happens." Detective Marcus Webb of the Milwaukee Police Department's gang unit had been watching the Hells Angels for 3 years and had come to a conclusion most cops never reached. They weren't the enemy. They were complicated. They bent rules. They existed in gray areas. But they also protected their neighborhoods, helped veterans transition to civilian life, and operated by a code that was stricter than most churches. So when CPS called requesting police escort to seize a child from Hells Angels custody, Webb made a phone call of his own. "Silas, you got about 20 minutes before a shitstorm hits your position. CPS got a call about child endangerment. They're coming with uniforms to take the kid." Silas was in St. Mary's cafeteria drinking his 4th coffee when Webb's warning came through. He looked at his brothers, Reaper, Hangman, Nomad, Chains, Prospect, and the 2 younger members, Ghost and Mercy. 8 men who'd served their country, who'd bled for the American flag, who'd come home to a nation that thanked them with parades and forgot them with policy. "They're coming for Sabian," Silas said quietly. The cafeteria went silent. "The hell they are," Reaper growled. By the time CPS arrived with 2 squad cars and a social worker named Jennifer Marks, who looked fresh out of college and terrified to be there, the Hells Angels had formed a human wall outside the ICU. They weren't armed, weren't threatening, just standing. 8 men in leather cuts, arms crossed, faces carved from stone. "Gentlemen, we have a court order to take temporary custody of Sabian Miller pending an investigation," Mark said, her voice shaking. She held up paperwork like it was a shield. "We're not questioning your intentions, but the child's mother has been deemed—" "Deemed what?" Darlene appeared behind the Angels, having been pulled from Sabian's bedside. "I'm his mother. I'm right here. You want to take my son while he's fighting for his life?" "Ma'am, we've received credible reports that the child is in an unsafe environment. The association with a known criminal organization—" "We ain't criminals," Silas said softly. "We're veterans. Every man here served. We're also licensed business owners. We pay taxes, we vote. We're members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And the only reason that kid is alive right now is because we paid for his treatment when your system abandoned him." The standoff lasted 17 minutes. Police officers who knew the Angels, who'd worked with them on community outreach, who'd called them when gang violence threatened to explode and only the Angels could mediate. They stood awkwardly, hands away from weapons, not wanting this fight. And then the elevator dinged, and Police Chief Harold Reese stepped onto the floor. Reese was old-school Milwaukee, had worked his way up from beat cop to chief over 37 years. He'd seen the video. He'd gotten about 400 calls from citizens demanding he do something. And he'd made a decision. "Stand down," he told his officers. Then he turned to CPS. "Ms. Marks, the child is in a hospital receiving life-saving treatment. The mother is present. There is no immediate danger. Your investigation can proceed, but you're not removing this kid from medical care because someone made a phone call. Are we clear?" Marks looked like she wanted to argue, but the chief's face left no room. "Sir, the protocol doesn't override common sense. File your report. Interview the mother. But if you try to move that kid while he's critical, I will personally arrest you for reckless endangerment." CPS left. The officers left. And the Angels remained. A wall of leather protecting one small boy who'd proven that heroes came in the unlikeliest packages. But the war wasn't over. Because while the standoff had been happening, 2 prospects from the Angels' South Side chapter had been doing work of a different kind. They'd been hunting, and they'd found exactly what they were looking for. A man named Snake Miller, trying to buy a bus ticket to Detroit with a backpack full of cartel cash. Snake Miller had made it exactly 47 miles before the Angels caught him. He'd taken back roads toward Chicago, figured he'd disappear into the urban sprawl, maybe head south to Texas where the Baja cartel would pay him the back end of his fee for the bombing they thought had succeeded. What he hadn't figured on was that the Hells Angels had chapters in every major city in the Midwest and a communication network that would make the NSA jealous. When Silas Compton put out the call, Snake Miller, 5'10", 160 pounds, last seen near North Side, wanted for attempted murder and child abandonment, every Angel from Milwaukee to Memphis started looking. Ghost and Mercy found him at a Greyhound station in Kenosha, trying to blend in with truckers and runaways. They didn't make a scene, didn't need to, just walked up, one on each side, and Ghost said quietly, "You're coming back to Milwaukee." Snake tried to run. made it maybe 15 feet before Mercy tackled him in the parking lot, and then they were loading him into a van while confused civilians filmed on their phones, not understanding they were watching justice happen in real time. The drive back to Milwaukee was silent, except for Snake's increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate. "I got money. Cartel money. 50 grand. You can have it all. Just let me go." Mercy, who'd done 3 tours as a Marine and had seen what cowardice looked like in every form, didn't even look back. "You tried to kill your own kid. There ain't enough money in the world." They brought Snake to the clubhouse in Oildale, not to torture him. The angels weren't movie villains, but to make him face what he'd done before they turned him over to the law. Silas was waiting, and when Snake was dragged in, the 2 men stood face to face. "You wired a bomb that would have killed your son," Silas said quietly. "You saw him watching. You told him to stay quiet. You were willing to let him die to protect your payday." Snake's bravado crumbled. "I didn't think he wasn't supposed to be awake. He's 7 years old and dying of cancer, and he used the last of his strength to save my life from his own father." Silas's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You got any idea what kind of monster that makes you?" The Milwaukee PD arrived 20 minutes later, called by Silas himself. Detective Webb took Snake into custody on charges of attempted murder, possession of explosives, and a list of other crimes that would ensure he'd die in prison. As they loaded Snake into the squad car, he looked up at the clubhouse one last time, at the men who'd hunted him down not for revenge but for justice, and finally understood the difference between a gang and a brotherhood. "The angels have contacts in Waupun," Silas told Webb quietly. "You make sure he gets to general population. Let the other inmates know what he did." Webb nodded. In prison, there were hierarchies, and men who tried to kill their own children. They lived short, painful lives. Back at St. Mary's Hospital, Sabian was awake for the first time in 48 hours. His body was wrecked, would take months to heal, but the doctors said the word nobody had dared hope for: remission. Darlene sat beside her son's bed, holding his hand, and when Silas walked in, Sabian's face lit up. "Did you catch him?" the boy asked. "Your daddy?" Silas sat on the edge of the bed, gentle with this small, broken, heroic kid. "Yeah, little man, we caught him. He's not going to hurt anybody anymore." Sabian was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't want him to be my daddy anymore." Silas looked at Darlene, saw the tears streaming down her face, and made a decision that had been forming since the moment he'd read that purple crayon note. "You know what, Sabian? I've been thinking. I lost my son a long time ago, and I've got room in my life for a hero. What would you say if I told you that you and your mom could come live with me? That the club would make sure you got every treatment you needed? That you'd never have to worry about food or heat or Mrs. Gable ever again?" Sabian's eyes went wide. Like a new family?" "Exactly like a new family. We take care of our own. And kid, you saved my life. That makes you one of us." 3 months later, Milwaukee experienced one of those perfect May afternoons where the winter's brutality felt like a lie, and the air smelled like possibility. The Hells Angels. Milwaukee chapter had closed down their clubhouse lot for a private ceremony, but word had spread through the near north side, and residents lined the chain-link fence to watch. Sabian Miller stood in the center of the lot, 40 pounds heavier than the skeleton who'd collapsed on a frozen sidewalk. His hair had started growing back, fuzzy and soft. The feeding tube was gone. The cancer was in remission. Dr. Chen had called it a miracle, but Silas knew better. It was Brotherhood weaponized against a system designed to let people like Sabian fall through the cracks. The boy wore jeans and a t-shirt, sneakers that actually fit, and he was grinning like he'd won the lottery. Because in every way that mattered, he had. Darlene stood beside him, and she looked different too. No longer the exhausted ghost haunting a condemned apartment. She'd been hired as the Angels' office manager, handling the books for their legitimate businesses. She had a house now, 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other. She had stability, hope, a future. But today wasn't about her. Today was about her son. Silas stood before the chapter, all 63 members who'd made the trip from across Wisconsin and neighboring states. Reaper held a package wrapped in leather. "Brothers," Silas's voice carried across the lot, "we gather today to honor someone who exemplifies what we claim to be about. Loyalty, courage, protecting the innocent. 3 months ago, Sabian Miller saved my life. He did it knowing it might cost him his own. He did it because it was right. And in my experience, that's rarer than gold." He took the package from Reaper, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a leather vest, custom-made, sized for a 7-year-old. On the back, hand-tooled by Maria herself, were the words, "Little Angel." Below that, a patch that had been voted on and approved by every chapter in the region. Honorary member, Milwaukee. "Sabian Miller, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club would be honored if you'd wear our patch. You're too young to ride, too young to vote, too young for a lot of things. But you're not too young to be family. And that's what this means. You're our brother. Forever." Silas placed the tiny cut over Sabian's shoulders, and the boy's eyes filled with tears. The assembled angels erupted in applause, the sound thunderous, and residents outside the fence cheered too, because even people who'd never understand biker culture understood this. A dying kid had been saved by men society called criminals, and those men had moved heaven and earth to prove that family wasn't blood. It was choice. Sabian touched the patches, tracing the letters with small fingers. Then he looked up at Silas, and his voice was small but steady. "Does this mean you're my dad now?" Silas crouched down, eye level with the boy, and felt something he hadn't felt in 12 years. Complete. "If you'll have me, little man, legal papers are already filed. You and your mom are moving in permanent. We're a family." Sabian threw his arms around Silas's neck, and the big biker, who hadn't cried since 1998, found himself sobbing into a 7-year-old's shoulder while his brothers watched and understood that this moment, was why they wore the patch. Not for the bikes, not for the reputation, for this. Later that night, after the barbecue and the celebrations, Sabian sat on the back of Silas's Harley in the driveway. The engine was off, and the boy was just sitting there, hands on the grips, imagining. "One day," Silas said, settling in behind him, "when you're older and stronger, I'm going to teach you to ride, and you're going to feel freedom like you never imagined." Sabian turned, his face serious. "Will we help other kids? Like you helped me?" Silas smiled. "Every single one we can find, brother. Every single one." Above them, the Milwaukee sky faded from blue to purple, and in the distance, sirens wailed, someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis. But here, in this driveway, in this moment, there was only peace. The peace that came from knowing that somewhere in America, in the richest country in the world, there were still people who believed that a 7-year-old dying of cancer in a condemned building was worth saving. That brotherhood meant something, that justice could still win, and that sometimes the men society feared were the only ones brave enough to care. If you believe the child showed more courage than most adults will in their entire lives, and that brotherhood matters more than blood when blood has failed you, like and share this story. Subscribe now for more stories that expose the truth about who really protects the innocent when the system abandons them. Also, check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you.